The afternoon sun hung lazily over Tallahassee, casting long golden shadows across the grass of Myers Park. It was the kind of day that felt safe and ordinary, the kind of day when parents let their children run a little farther than usual because the world seemed calm and predictable. The park was full of laughter and movement. Children chased each other across the playground. Swings creaked rhythmically in the warm breeze, and the distant sound of a lawnmower hummed like background music. Families sat on picnic blankets, sharing sandwiches and stories, enjoying a peaceful weekend that felt completely uneventful. At first, no one noticed the two men sitting on a bench near the edge of the playground. They didn't stand out immediately, at least not in a way that would cause alarm. Parks often attracted travelers, drifters, and people simply passing through. But over time, small details began to draw quiet attention. The men's clothes looked worn and dusty, as if they had been traveling for weeks without stopping. Their hair was long and tangled, their beards uneven and unkempt. They didn't look like tourists or locals. They looked like people who didn't belong anywhere in particular. What truly caught people's attention, however, were the children with them. Two young kids wandered nearby, moving slowly and silently as if they were unsure of their surroundings. They were barefoot despite the rough gravel paths and patches of dry grass. Their clothes were stained and oversized, hanging loosely from their thin frames. One of the children crouched near a trash can and began digging through it, searching carefully as though it was something normal and familiar. A few parents exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the scene felt deeply wrong. The children didn't laugh or run like the others. They didn't ask to play or try to join the games happening around them. Instead, they stayed close to the two men, moving cautiously, their eyes scanning the park as if they were afraid of being noticed. One child clutched a worn stuffed animal missing one of its eyes. The other kept rubbing their arms nervously, as though trying to stay warm despite the heat. A mother named Linda watched the scene unfold from a picnic table. At first, she tried to ignore the uneasy feeling building in her chest. She told herself she was being judgmental, that appearances could be misleading. But the more she watched, the more the feeling grew stronger. When she saw the child reach into the trash can again and pull out a half-eaten sandwich, her stomach tightened. She couldn't sit still any longer. Linda walked slowly toward the bench, her steps careful and polite. She didn't want to accuse anyone of anything. She just wanted to understand what was happening. As she approached, one of the men looked up and smiled in a way that felt rehearsed and strangely calm. His eyes didn't match his expression. They seemed distant, almost empty, as if he were watching her from far away. Linda introduced herself and asked gently if the children were okay. The man nodded quickly and said they were on a learning adventure. He explained that the children were being taught survival skills and independence. He spoke confidently, using words that sounded thoughtful and philosophical, but the explanation felt strange in the middle of a city park. Linda nodded politely, but her concern didn't fade. The children's silence and fearful expressions contradicted the calm tone of the man's voice. As Linda walked back to her table, she noticed other parents watching the men now. Quiet conversations began spreading across the park. People were whispering to each other, comparing observations and sharing the same uneasy feeling. Within minutes, someone had already picked up a phone and dialed the police. The officers arrived quickly, their patrol car pulling into the parking lot with a quiet but noticeable presence. The sight of uniforms brought a ripple of relief through the crowd. Parents gathered their children closer, watching as the officers approached the bench. The men remained seated, appearing calm and unbothered, as if they had expected this moment. The officers asked simple questions at first. They wanted to know the men's names, where they were traveling, and who the children were. The answers came slowly and didn't seem to fit together. One man said they were traveling across the country. The other said they had just arrived in Florida. When asked about the children's parents, the men hesitated before giving vague explanations about guardianship and community living. The longer the conversation continued, the more confusing it became. The officers exchanged glances that spoke louder than words. Something wasn't right. The children clung closer to each other, watching silently as the adults talked around them. One officer crouched down to speak gently to the younger child, but the child avoided eye contact and said nothing. The decision was made quickly. The men were asked to come to the station for further questioning. They didn't resist. They stood calmly and walked toward the patrol car, as if they had already accepted the outcome. The children were placed under protective care, wrapped in blankets and guided gently into another vehicle. The park slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations continued long after the police cars disappeared from view. At the station, the men remained calm during questioning. They repeated the same explanation about travel and education, describing their group as a community focused on freedom and learning. They insisted the children were safe and well cared for. Their words were calm and measured, but something about their tone felt rehearsed, as though they had practiced these answers many times before. Meanwhile, officers began searching the men's van. At first, it looked ordinary, cluttered with bags, blankets, and travel supplies. But as they dug deeper, the discovery of strange items began to change the mood entirely. Stacks of photographs were hidden beneath clothing and equipment. Some showed children in unfamiliar locations, standing in circles or gathered in groups. Maps were folded carefully and marked with lines and symbols that didn't make sense at first glance. Then came the notebooks, dozens of them, filled with handwritten notes, coded symbols, and lists of names. The pages were detailed and organized, far more structured than anyone expected. One officer flipped through a notebook slowly, his expression growing more serious with each page. The writing was strange and difficult to understand, filled with references to travel schedules, locations, and meetings. When the officer opened one particular notebook, he stopped turning pages. Written across the first page in bold letters were two words that would soon echo far beyond the small police station. The finders. The room fell quiet as the officers exchanged glances. What had started as a routine welfare check in a park had suddenly become something far more complicated. The evidence suggested planning, organization, and a level of coordination that didn't match the simple story the men had told. As the sun set over Tallahassee, the investigation was only beginning. The peaceful afternoon in the park had opened a door into a mystery that no one yet understood, and the deeper authorities would look, the stranger the story would become. The investigation into the men and children from Myers Park had just begun, but already it was clear this was not a simple case. The police officers who had initially responded to the scene were still trying to piece together the strange events of that afternoon. The children, though safe, were frightened and uncommunicative, their small hands clinging to blankets and toys that offered a faint sense of comfort. The men in custody, who had claimed to be part of a community called the Finders, provided answers that were both vague and unsettling, insisting that their lifestyle was one of freedom, education, and exploration. Yet their words did not match the reality officers were seeing. After questioning the two men, investigators reached out to authorities in Washington, D.C., where the group was reported to be based. It was then that the case escalated from a local investigation to a federal matter. The FBI became involved, bringing with them agents with experience in unusual cult activity and child protection. They quickly determined that a simple welfare check had uncovered the tip of a much larger and more disturbing iceberg. There were hints of international connections, unusual travel patterns, and an organized network operating quietly under the radar of the law. The first major breakthrough came when investigators traced one of the men's addresses to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The building was unremarkable from the outside, an industrial rectangle of brick and steel in a quiet industrial park. No signs marked it, and only a faint trail of tire marks led up to the loading dock. At first glance, it looked abandoned. There were no lights, no movement, and no apparent activity that suggested it housed a community of people or children. But investigators had learned not to trust appearances. The warehouse was owned through a shell company, with documents tying it indirectly to members of the Finders. When agents entered the building, they immediately noticed the strange combination of chaos and order. On one side of the warehouse were stacks of filing cabinets and shelves packed with boxes of documents. On the other side, computers and office equipment hummed quietly, processing information at a surprising speed for 1987. The technology alone was unusual for a group that claimed to live simply and travel constantly. There were multiple monitors connected to printers and daily data terminals, displaying spreadsheets, lists, and travel schedules. Every detail was catalogued meticulously. Agents moved carefully through the building, taking note of each room. In one corner, there was a large office space that seemed to serve as the nave center of the operation. Maps of the United States and other countries lined the walls, each with colored pins marking specific locations. Some of the maps were marked with dates, others with symbols that were initially indecipherable. Investigators realized that this was a logistical operation of significant scale, far beyond what the men had described when initially questioned in Tallahassee. But the documents and maps were only the beginning. As agents searched further, they found photographs scattered across desks and in filing cabinets. Many of the images depicted children, some smiling, some appearing solemn, often in unfamiliar locations or in the company of adults who wore masks or costumes. A series of photographs showed groups of children standing in circles at night, their faces illuminated by flickering lights. The images were not just eerie, they suggested rituals or activities conducted away from public scrutiny, all carefully documented. The presence of so many images and the methodical manner in which they were stored suggested planning and intent. Investigators also discovered notebooks filled with coded writing, lists of names, schedules, and locations. Some pages included references to training sessions and educational programs, but the language was cryptic and suggested a hidden meaning. Agents quickly realized that the notebooks were not merely diaries or personal logs, they were operational documents, detailing the movement, activities, and plans of the group. Each page suggested a highly organized network, a system that was far more complex than a casual community of free-spirited travelers. The computers added another layer of complexity. In 1987, such equipment was rare and expensive, especially for a group claiming minimal resources. The machines stored records of communication, travel logs, and files that were still being analyzed. Some printouts referenced contacts overseas, while others included cryptic notes about special training or preparations. Agents working through the night quickly realized that the technology was being used to maintain a level of sophistication that could evade standard investigative methods. One of the most unsettling discoveries was a series of maps with red pins placed in cities across the United States, and even in other countries. Some pins were accompanied by dates, others by symbols that investigators could not immediately decipher. It became apparent that these locations were significant, likely tied to the group's activities. Federal agents noted the possibility that children could have been moved between these sites, given the meticulous records and the patterns of travel they were beginning to reconstruct. As the investigation continued, the tone of the search shifted. What had initially seemed like a strange but contained group began to appear something more organized, something potentially dangerous. The agents found plans, lists of supplies, and schedules that indicated careful planning for events involving children. While the exact nature of these events was unclear, the level of preparation and secrecy suggested activities that were deliberately hidden from public view. Officers also noted evidence of substantial funding. Receipts, invoices, and account statements indicated large sums of money moving in and out of the organization. There were records of vehicle purchases, travel expenses, and payments to suppliers. The group was not merely surviving on donations or casual support. It had access to significant resources, allowing it to operate both domestically and internationally without drawing attention. The financial records also suggested sophistication in maintaining secrecy, using shell companies and coded transactions to obscure the source and destination of funds. Investigators quickly realized that they were dealing with a network that extended beyond the warehouse. The scale of the operation, the sophistication of its records, and the international references and documents suggested a highly organized structure. Members of the finders appeared to maintain constant communication with one another, using both written codes and early digital methods to coordinate activities. The implications were alarming. This was not simply a community of free-spirited travelers, but an organized entity capable of moving children and resources across cities and countries while remaining largely invisible to law enforcement. As the agents compiled their initial reports, they began to grasp the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The photographs, notebooks, maps, and computers were just the tip of the iceberg. The level of detail in the planning, the international references, and the financial resources all suggested a network with serious intent and capabilities. The evidence raised questions that investigators were only beginning to ask. What were the ultimate goals of the finders? Were children being moved for education, exploitation, or something far darker? How far did the network extend? And who were the adults behind it? In one corner of the warehouse, agents discovered more than just maps and computers. There were sleeping quarters, small and sparsely furnished, suggesting that some members of the group had stayed there for extended periods. Personal belongings, toys, and children's clothing were neatly organized in boxes, indicating that children had been living there at some point. While there was no immediate evidence of abuse, the living conditions were unusual for what the group had claimed publicly. The presence of children in this type of controlled and secluded environment was enough to raise serious concerns. As the day turned to evening, investigators continued to photograph, document, and collect evidence. Every corner of the warehouse revealed something new, from printed flight itineraries to lists of names and addresses. Agents worked tirelessly to catalog the information, knowing that every detail could be crucial. The sheer volume of evidence made it clear that this was more than a local matter. It was a case that could have national and even international implications. By the time the search concluded, federal agents and local authorities had amassed a collection of evidence that was unprecedented for a case that had begun with 2 men and 2 children in a park. The warehouse was a central hub, meticulously maintained, and clearly used to coordinate activities that had remained hidden from public view. The scale of the operation, combined with the organized structure and international references, suggested that the finders were capable of more than anyone had imagined. When agents left the warehouse, the magnitude of the discovery weighed heavily on everyone involved. What had begun as a small concern about neglected children had grown into an investigation that raised alarming questions about secrecy, organization, and intent. The warehouse was not merely a building. It was the center of a hidden world, one that had operated quietly under the radar for years. And while investigators had uncovered much, they knew this was only the beginning. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling questions emerged. Who else was involved? How far did the network extend? And most importantly, what had happened to the children who had traveled with the finders in other cities and states? As federal agents prepared to continue the investigation, they understood that they were standing on the edge of something much larger than anyone had anticipated. A mystery that could challenge their understanding of safety, secrecy, and power. The warehouse was not the end of the story. It was the opening chapter of a case that would grow increasingly complex, mysterious, and unsettling. The men from Myers Park had been the first clue, but the warehouse revealed the true scope of the finders, a network organized, resourceful, and capable of hiding in plain sight. And as investigators prepared to follow the threads of evidence, one thing was certain. The finders were not a harmless group, and the investigation was only beginning. As the investigation into the finders intensified, federal authorities began piecing together evidence from the warehouse. The photographs, the notebooks, the maps, and the computers had already painted a disturbing picture. But the real breakthrough came when investigators realized that the group's operations were not just local, they were international. The computers, though primitive by today's standards, contained files, schedules, and printouts that hinted at a level of organization far beyond what the casual observer could imagine. Each document, each coded message, seemed to point toward a hidden network carefully maintained over years, a network that extended far beyond Florida. The first clue came in the form of coded notebooks. Investigators brought in cryptography experts to help decipher the symbols, shorthand, and seemingly arbitrary letters and numbers scattered across the pages. At first, the code appeared random, but patterns soon emerged. References to dates, locations, and names of children suggested a system for tracking travel, meetings, and events. Some of the pages contained instructions written in plain language, interspersed with cryptic notations that suggested hidden meanings. Investigators realized that the finders were documenting every movement and interaction, keeping detailed records to ensure the group operated smoothly and remained undetected. While the notebooks provided a framework, the real revelations came from the computers. Though 1987 technology was limited, the machines contained spreadsheets, lists, and typed documents that showed frequent communication between members of the group. Contact information for individuals in multiple cities and countries was stored carefully, often encoded with numbers or shorthand. Flight logs indicated patterns of movement that were impossible to ignore. Several children listed in the documents appeared to travel with the group, sometimes moving from city to city, attending events or gatherings whose purpose was never clearly stated. Messages found on the computers suggested planning of events described as educational or training programs, but investigators struggled to understand what these programs actually entailed. Some of the communications referenced young travelers being prepared for relocation, or initiations taking place in remote areas. Though the language was vague, the context suggested that children were being moved with intent, away from public oversight, and possibly without parental knowledge or consent. Investigators began to consider the possibility that these were not casual educational exercises, but organized activities with far more serious implications. The patterns of communication between members of the finders indicated a network operating under strict secrecy. Messages often used coded phrases or metaphors to conceal true intentions. For example, one memo discussed preparing seedlings for growth while listing children's names and ages, and another mentioned the harvest schedule, seemingly referring to movement and attendance at events. Investigators, both local and federal, had to work carefully, cross-referencing these phrases with flight records, hotel bookings, and eyewitness reports to make sense of what appeared to be highly deliberate obfuscation. Flight logs and travel itineraries added to the unease. Several children mentioned in the documents were listed on flights departing from airports in Florida, Texas, and the West Coast. Some records indicated international travel, including destinations in Europe and South America. Coordinating such movement, especially without attracting attention, suggested that the group had considerable resources and knowledge of travel logistics. Agents began to question whether the finders operated with some form of protection, whether through connections or simply by exploiting loopholes in the system, and whether their influence extended beyond what was immediately visible. As investigators dug deeper into the communications, they discovered references to a hierarchy within the group. Certain adults were described as mentors or coordinators, while others were identified as caretakers of children during travel or events. The structure suggested a level of sophistication that belied the group's claim of being an informal, free-spirited community. Roles and responsibilities were assigned systematically, and communication networks were maintained across regions, indicating a coordinated approach to logistics, oversight, and documentation. One particularly disturbing aspect of the messages was the level of planning surrounding the children. Notes described schedules for teaching survival skills, group activities, and lessons designed to reinforce obedience and loyalty to the group. While some of the activities could be interpreted as harmless or educational in nature, the consistency and secrecy of the planning raised red flags. Investigators began questioning whether some of the programs went beyond standard education, veering into areas of control, manipulation, or exploitation. The investigation also revealed the use of advanced record-keeping for the time. Each child appeared to have a file that tracked travel, behavior, and participation in group activities. The files included detailed notes about skills taught, reactions to lessons, and interactions with other members. Some of these documents suggested that behavioral responses were monitored carefully, potentially to ensure compliance or obedience to the adults in charge. Investigators noted that the level of monitoring was unusual and troubling, especially when combined with the secrecy and coordination of the group's activities. As the FBI reviewed the communications, they began to uncover patterns linking members of the finders to locations outside the United States. There were coded references to meetings in Europe, mentions of summer camps in remote locations, and travel arrangements that included multiple children. Agents also discovered financial records that suggested funding for these trips, including hotel bookings, airline tickets, and reimbursements for supplies. The scope of the group's operations was far broader than initially believed, extending across borders and potentially involving dozens of children. Interviews with the men from Myers Park added context to the communications. They described the group as focused on creating independence and self-reliance in children, claiming that strict rules and unusual experiences were meant to prepare them for life. However, their explanations did not align with the evidence found in the notebooks and on the computers. Investigators observed a gap between the group's stated purpose and the logistical realities suggested by the documents. The complexity, scale, and secrecy of operations implied a level of control and coordination inconsistent with the idea of a purely educational community. Some of the coded messages also referenced individuals outside the immediate group, people who seemed to facilitate or support the activities. These contacts were sometimes named directly, but often referred to by initials or numerical codes. Investigators attempted to trace these individuals, cross-referencing the names with addresses, employment records, and travel documents. The trail led to connections with businesses, charities, and other organizations, though the purpose of these links was not immediately clear. It raised the unsettling possibility that the finders had allies in positions of influence, whether intentionally or through inadvertent complicity. As the investigation unfolded, analysts realized that the coded communications were deliberately designed to confuse and mislead anyone who might intercept them. The cryptic language, double meanings, and obfuscation suggested awareness of scrutiny and a desire to conceal true intentions. Investigators noted that the group's record-keeping, while meticulous, was also intentionally opaque, making it difficult to prove wrongdoing without direct evidence or testimony from witnesses. The gap between what was documented and what could be legally interpreted became a major challenge for law enforcement. The more investigators analyzed the communications, the more alarming the picture became. The finders were not merely a group of itinerant travelers teaching survival skills. They were a carefully structured organization operating across cities and countries, moving children and resources with precision. Every message, notebook entry, and flight log suggested planning, coordination, and concealment. The coded language indicated awareness of potential legal or social scrutiny, suggesting that the group understood the risks of detection and had implemented measures to avoid it. As investigators delved deeper, they began connecting seemingly unrelated pieces of information. A flight log from one city aligned with a note in a notebook listing children scheduled for relocation. A photograph of a mass gathering corresponded to a coded message describing a nighttime program for select participants. Every detail, no matter how small, reinforced the idea that the finders had an organized method for carrying out activities that were deliberately hidden from the public eye. The FBI began reaching out to international contacts, hoping to trace the origins and destinations of some of the coded messages. They discovered that the network may have extended to Europe, with references to meetings and camps in countries that investigators had not yet been able to verify. Though the exact nature of these overseas activities remained unclear, it was evident that the group's operations were not limited to the United States. The possibility of an international network raised the stakes considerably, transforming a local child neglect case into a potential global investigation. At the same time, the men in custody maintained a calm, confident demeanor, insisting that their actions were legal and educational. Their explanations often contradicted the evidence, yet their composure suggested familiarity with legal procedures and a deep understanding of how to present themselves to authorities. Investigators began to suspect that the group had experience with law enforcement and knew how to protect itself, adding another layer of complexity to the case. As weeks turned into months, analysts continued to decode messages, cross-reference flight logs, and trace the connections suggested by notebooks and photographs. Each revelation raised new questions. Who else was involved in the network? How were the children being selected and monitored? And most importantly, what was the ultimate purpose of the group's elaborate operations? The lack of clear answers left investigators frustrated but determined to continue piecing together the puzzle. The communications revealed patterns of secrecy, coordination, and planning that suggested the finders were more than just a small community with unusual beliefs. They were a network with resources, logistics, and a strategic approach to concealing their activities. Every flight, every coded message, and every notebook entry contributed to a growing understanding of a group that operated in plain sight while maintaining a highly structured and hidden world. Despite the progress, the investigation faced challenges. The coded language, careful record-keeping, and disappearance of key documents created significant obstacles. Investigators had to rely on painstaking analysis, cryptography experts, and meticulous cross-referencing to build a picture of the group's activities. The effort required patience, persistence, and ingenuity, as every lead seemed to open multiple new questions. By the time this phase of the investigation was complete, it was clear that the finders' secret communications represented the backbone of their operations. Without the coded notebooks, flight records, and digital documents, investigators would have had little understanding of the group's reach, methods, or organization. The communications revealed a network operating with purpose and intent, moving children and resources across cities and countries while maintaining secrecy. The evidence suggested a coordinated effort to hide activities that could be considered illegal or unethical, leaving investigators with the chilling realization that they were only beginning to uncover the full extent of the network. The investigation into the finders had grown from a small, local child welfare concern in a Florida park to a sprawling federal inquiry with implications that stretched across state lines and even overseas. By late 1987, the FBI had taken the lead, analyzing the thousands of documents, photographs, flight logs, and coded notebooks collected from the warehouse and the men in custody. Analysts worked around the clock, cross-referencing every piece of evidence and attempting to trace connections that could reveal the true scope of the group's activities. It was becoming increasingly clear that the finders were not simply an eccentric community teaching children survival skills. They were an organized network operating with precision and secrecy. Despite the overwhelming amount of evidence, something strange began happening almost immediately. Investigators who were accustomed to working with federal agencies noticed unusual interference. Files that had been meticulously catalogued suddenly disappeared from local offices. Reports that had been written and verified were removed or heavily redacted. Some investigators received phone calls instructing them not to pursue certain leads, while others were told that the case was under special review by higher authorities. The messages were subtle but unmistakable. The investigation, which had been moving forward at a rapid pace, suddenly slowed under pressure. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came during a meeting with senior FBI officials. Agents who had been analyzing the finders' communications were instructed to hand over all materials relating to international contacts to a separate, undisclosed division. They were told that ongoing operations were sensitive, and that no further action should be taken without explicit authorization from the highest levels of the Bureau. Officers who had worked tirelessly to trace the coded messages, track flight records, and document suspicious activities were suddenly being sidelined, their efforts restricted by bureaucratic barriers that seemed designed to prevent progress. At the same time, local detectives who had first responded to the park incident found themselves marginalized. They had witnessed the condition of the children firsthand, questioned the men, and seen the contents of the van and warehouse. Yet their reports, which included detailed descriptions of evidence suggesting possible child exploitation, were quietly removed from official records. Attempts to access the files were met with resistance, explanations that cited federal jurisdiction, and, in some cases, direct warnings to cease inquiry. The message was clear: there were limits to how far the investigation could go, and those pushing too aggressively risked professional consequences. The reason for this interference was never fully explained. Some investigators suspected political influence. Others speculated that the case had become entangled with intelligence operations or covert programs that required secrecy. The lack of transparency fueled rumors that the finders had connections with powerful individuals or organizations, possibly even internationally. Agents who were used to following facts rather than speculation found themselves confronting questions they could not answer. Every new lead seemed to reach a wall. Every document disappeared into an opaque bureaucracy. The situation escalated when journalists began to inquire about the case. Reports of the initial park incident and the warehouse discovery had begun to leak into the local press, and investigative reporters were eager to uncover the truth behind the finders. Yet their inquiries were met with official silence. Statements were carefully worded to downplay the significance of the group, emphasizing only that 2 men had been arrested for child neglect and that no further criminal activity had been confirmed. The press, frustrated by the lack of access to documents and unwilling witnesses, struggled to report a full story. Meanwhile, investigators on the ground faced a strange tension. The evidence they had collected suggested far more serious misconduct. Yet officially, the case was being presented as minor and contained. Internally, the atmosphere among law enforcement became tense and uneasy. Detectives who had once worked tirelessly to uncover the network's reach began to experience professional consequences. Some were reassigned, others quietly removed from the case without explanation, and a few received warnings about the sensitivity of the investigation. There were even whispered conversations among agents about the possibility that pursuing the case too aggressively could be dangerous, though no direct threats were made. The level of caution suggested that the finders, or those connected to them, were protected by forces beyond the immediate understanding of the investigators. At the heart of the investigation were the children, still under protective care. Social workers who had interacted with the children reported that they were frightened, withdrawn, and reluctant to speak about their experiences. Some children mentioned traveling schools or games they had participated in, but these accounts were vague and fragmented. Investigators were keenly aware that these children held critical information that could expose the network, yet the political and bureaucratic pressures surrounding the case made it difficult to act on their testimony. Interviews were limited, access was restricted, and opportunities to gather full accounts were curtailed. As the investigation slowed, analysts began to notice patterns that suggested the interference was not coincidental. Key evidence, including photographs of gatherings, flight logs, and documents describing travel and communication between members, was removed or withheld from investigators. Requests to copy or review these items were denied or redirected to other agencies. Files that had been publicly documented suddenly vanished. It became increasingly apparent that someone or some group was deliberately suppressing information that could have led to broader exposure of the finders. The very system that should have supported the investigation was actively preventing it. The restrictions were formalized when the federal government issued statements claiming that the finders had been thoroughly investigated and that no further action was necessary. Officially, the group was described as a harmless community with unusual lifestyles, and the children were considered safe and cared for. The language was carefully crafted to minimize public concern while effectively halting any additional inquiry. Investigators who had been deeply involved in the case were left frustrated, unable to reconcile the official narrative with the overwhelming evidence they had seen. Some agents went further, speaking anonymously to journalists and researchers years later. They described an extraordinary level of intervention, suggesting that the case had been deliberately shut down to protect individuals connected to the group or the organization itself. According to these insiders, powerful interests may have been at play, including government officials, wealthy donors, or international contacts. Though the specifics were never confirmed, the consistent theme was that the investigation had been deliberately restricted and controlled. Despite these setbacks, some investigators refused to abandon their pursuit of the truth. They continued to follow leads quietly, often outside official channels. They interviewed former members of the group, traced financial records, and documented personal accounts from children who had participated in activities. These unofficial investigations revealed fragments of a larger network, showing that the finders had operated with considerable organization, resources, and secrecy. Even without full access to official files, the evidence suggested that the group's reach was far greater than publicly acknowledged. Journalists who later reviewed the case noted the inconsistencies between the official reports and the evidence collected by investigators. Photographs and flight logs indicated regular movement of children across cities and countries. Notebooks showed meticulous planning, communication networks, and assigned roles within the organization. Witnesses recalled events that were clearly structured and supervised, contradicting the claim that the finders were merely a group of free-spirited travelers teaching independence. These inconsistencies fueled ongoing speculation and conspiracy theories about why the investigation had been halted. The case also highlighted the limitations of law enforcement when faced with powerful, organized groups operating across jurisdictions. Local police could only observe and report. Federal agencies could step in, but political and bureaucratic pressures could restrict action. The evidence of a network that coordinated travel, maintained records, and used coded communications demonstrated that the finders had a sophisticated system of operation. Yet despite these indicators, official channels moved to close the case rather than pursue it to its logical conclusions. For the children involved, the shutdown of the investigation had lasting consequences. Many were returned to environments that were still monitored by members or associates of the group. Social workers reported ongoing fear and trauma, with some children displaying signs of psychological distress long after their involvement with the finders ended. The abrupt conclusion of the investigation left them with little sense of justice or resolution, and the adults responsible for their care often remained unaccountable in any meaningful way. Years later, researchers and journalists attempting to uncover the truth were met with the same obstacles faced by investigators in 1987. Requests for records were denied or heavily redacted. Key files were missing or incomplete. Witnesses were reluctant to speak, citing fear or confusion. The narrative presented to the public remained unchanged. The finders had been investigated, no crime had been proven, and the children were safe. Yet the evidence, fragments of which survived, painted a far darker picture. The mysterious shutdown of the investigation left an indelible mark on law enforcement and journalism alike. It demonstrated how bureaucracy, political influence, and secrecy could override evidence and common sense. It showed that even in cases involving children and organized networks, the pursuit of truth could be blocked by forces beyond the control of those dedicated to justice. For investigators who had seen the evidence firsthand, the decision to halt the case was a source of ongoing frustration and disbelief. Despite official closure, questions remained. Who had the authority to intervene and halt the investigation? Why were so many files removed or hidden? How extensive was the Finders network? And who else might have been involved? These unanswered questions fueled speculation and conspiracy, ensuring that the story of the Finders would not fade into obscurity. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about the limits of accountability, the power of secrecy, and the fragility of justice when confronted with organized, well-protected groups. By the end of 1987, the Finders investigation had effectively been shut down. Officially, there were no crimes proven beyond the initial child neglect incident. Unofficially, investigators knew that the group had operated with precision, secrecy, and coordination across states and possibly internationally. The children were returned to relative safety, but the adults responsible for orchestrating the network largely avoided scrutiny. The files, communications, and evidence collected remained incomplete, leaving gaps in the story that may never be fully resolved. For law enforcement, the case was a lesson in frustration, demonstrating that even when evidence is compelling, political and bureaucratic pressures can override the pursuit of justice. For the public, the official narrative suggested that the threat had been neutralized, but the surviving documents, testimonies, and photographs hinted at a story far more disturbing than most would ever know. The Finders, once exposed in a small park in Tallahassee, had become a symbol of secrecy, influence, and the hidden power of organized networks operating just beyond the reach of accountability. Even decades later, researchers reviewing the case remarked on the unusual and unprecedented nature of the shutdown. The disappearance of evidence, the redirection of investigators, and the rapid closure of the case all pointed to interference from powerful entities. The truth of the Finders, while partially documented, remained incomplete, and the children who had been part of the network carried with them the memory of a world most adults could scarcely comprehend. The mystery of the investigation's abrupt conclusion only added to the legend of the Finders, ensuring that their story remained one of the most enigmatic and unsettling chapters in American criminal history. The shutdown of the investigation marked a turning point. The narrative presented to the public suggested normalcy and resolution, but for those involved, the reality was far more complicated. Evidence had been collected, networks had been partially traced, and communications had been deciphered, yet the final outcomes were dictated not by facts but by unseen pressures and opaque decisions. The Finders remained an active topic of speculation, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that the true extent of hidden operations could never be fully known. By the time the dust settled, it was clear that the Finders case would not end with clear justice. The investigation had revealed a network, a system, and a level of coordination that defied easy explanation, but the ultimate truth had been obscured by bureaucratic interference. Investigators who had dedicated themselves to uncovering the facts were left with partial knowledge, questions that could never be fully answered, and a deep sense of unease about the power of secrecy in shaping the outcomes of even the most serious cases. The story of the Finders had moved from a small park in Tallahassee to a federal investigation of extraordinary scope, yet the final chapter remained unwritten. The shutdown of the investigation ensured that much of the truth would remain hidden, leaving investigators, journalists, and the public to grapple with the haunting question: how much had truly been uncovered, and how much remained deliberately concealed? Years had passed since the investigation into the Finders began, yet the case refused to disappear from the minds of those who had worked on it. The initial arrest of the two men in Myers Park and the discovery of the warehouse had sparked national attention, but the abrupt shutdown of the investigation left everyone with more questions than answers. Local law enforcement officers, federal agents, journalists, and researchers all wrestled with fragments of evidence that hinted at a larger, more sinister operation, yet they faced the same frustrating barrier. The truth seemed deliberately obscured, hidden behind bureaucratic walls and vanished files. The children involved remained a haunting element of the story. Many had been placed under protective care and eventually returned to families or foster environments, but the psychological impact of their experiences lingered. Interviews conducted years later with some of these children, now adults, revealed fragmented memories of strange events, unsupervised travels, and gatherings they could not fully explain. They remembered being moved from place to place, sometimes in secrecy, under the guidance of adults who treated the experience as normal and instructive. These accounts, though incomplete, suggested that the group had operated with both meticulous planning and a disturbing disregard for conventional boundaries of child welfare. Journalists and independent researchers who attempted to piece together the case quickly encountered the same obstacles faced by the original investigators. Requests for documents under the Freedom of Information Act were met with redactions or denials. Key files were missing entirely, and many records were classified or claimed to have been destroyed. In some instances, official explanations suggested that sensitive information relating to national security prevented disclosure, a phrase that only deepened suspicion about the true scope of the finders' operations. The pattern of missing evidence, combined with the initial removal of files during the investigation, suggested that powerful forces had intervened to limit what could be publicly known. Despite the lack of official records, some evidence remained. Copies of photographs, flight logs, and notebooks surfaced over the years, often in the hands of private researchers or investigative journalists. These remnants painted a disturbing picture of an organization that had operated with remarkable precision. Children were moved between locations, schedules were carefully documented, and communications were maintained across state lines and even internationally. The surviving notebooks contained coded entries detailing activities, training programs, and the roles of adult members, reinforcing the impression of a structured, methodical network. Even fragments of these documents were enough to show that the finders had maintained operations far beyond what could be understood at the time of the initial investigation. One of the most unsettling aspects of the surviving evidence was the apparent sophistication of the group's communication methods. Messages often used code words, metaphorical language, and numeric symbols to conceal meaning. References to growth, harvests, and training programs could allude to child relocation, indoctrination, or other activities disguised as education or adventure. Investigators who examined these communications noted the group's awareness of surveillance and law enforcement, suggesting that the finders had developed their system with an understanding of how to avoid detection while still maintaining meticulous records. Researchers also discovered evidence indicating that some members had connections to influential individuals and organizations. Letters, photographs, and travel records suggested interactions with figures in business, politics, and law enforcement, though the exact nature of these connections remained unclear. Some journalists speculated that these ties provided protection for the group, allowing them to operate without interference, while others suggested that the true scope of their influence would never be fully known. The very possibility that the finders were shielded by powerful allies added a layer of complexity to the mystery, making the case far more than just a local or regional concern. The warehouse, which had once served as the center of operations, had long since been emptied. Investigators who returned to the site years later reported that it had been stripped of nearly all evidence. Computers, filing cabinets, and documents were gone, leaving only empty rooms and faint traces of activity. For those who had spent weeks cataloging the materials, the disappearance was both frustrating and ominous. How could so much critical evidence vanish? And why had no one been held accountable for its removal? The unanswered questions haunted everyone involved in the investigation, creating an enduring sense of unease. As the case faded from the headlines, the story of the finders lived on in books, documentaries, and investigative reports. Writers and filmmakers attempted to reconstruct the network's operations using surviving documents and interviews with former members, children, and investigators. The narrative that emerged was chilling, a network operating under a guise of education and travel, moving children with meticulous planning, documenting every action, and maintaining secrecy through coded communication. Even with incomplete information, the pattern of behavior was clear, suggesting that the group's activities were deliberate, organized, and deeply hidden from public scrutiny. The children's recollections, though often fragmented, added human depth to the surviving records. They spoke of strange instructions, secret travels, and activities that were framed as learning exercises but often left them fearful and confused. Some described being taught to obey rules without question, to move silently, and to avoid drawing attention. Others remembered gatherings that were unsettling, with adults wearing masks or performing rituals they did not understand. These accounts, when combined with flight logs, coded messages, and photographs, reinforced the impression of a highly structured and secretive operation. One of the enduring mysteries of the case involved the sudden intervention of federal authorities during the initial investigation. Local detectives had been sidelined, files removed, and leads restricted, but no public explanation was ever provided. Some agents suggested that the case may have overlapped with sensitive intelligence operations, though evidence to confirm this theory was lacking. Others believed that the network's connections to influential individuals had prompted deliberate suppression of the investigation. The exact reasons for the shutdown remain unknown, leaving a lingering question that continues to provoke speculation and concern. Even decades later, researchers and investigative journalists continued to revisit the case. They sought missing documents, traced international contacts, and attempted to corroborate the surviving evidence with interviews and eyewitness accounts. Each piece of information added to the complexity of the story, reinforcing the sense that the finders had operated with intent, sophistication, and secrecy. Some reports hinted at broader networks, suggesting that the group's reach may have extended into areas never documented or publicly acknowledged. The incomplete nature of the surviving evidence left more questions than answers, but it also confirmed that the group's activities were far-reaching and deliberate. The mystery of the finders is further compounded by the lack of legal accountability. No major convictions were ever obtained beyond the initial arrests, and the evidence that might have supported prosecutions was either removed or rendered inaccessible. Investigators, journalists, and researchers who examined the case all faced the same frustration. A network that clearly existed and operated systematically was allowed to vanish into obscurity, leaving behind only fragments and tantalizing clues. This absence of resolution has fueled theories, speculation, and ongoing investigations, ensuring that the finders remain a subject of intrigue and concern. For many involved, the case is a reminder of the fragility of truth and justice when confronted with secrecy and power. The surviving evidence, the photographs, coded messages, flight logs, and fragmented notebooks, provides only glimpses into a network that operated largely beyond oversight. The children's experiences, though partially documented, reveal the human impact of an organization that prioritized control and secrecy over transparency and accountability. The combination of lost evidence, limited legal recourse, and bureaucratic intervention creates a story that is as disturbing for what is known as it is for what remains hidden. One particularly chilling aspect of the case is the notion that the finders could have continued operating undetected in some capacity. While the high-profile attention in 1987 temporarily disrupted their activities, the disappearance of records and the lack of public prosecutions suggest that the group, or elements of it, may have persisted. Investigators and researchers who revisit the case note that the network structure was designed to be resilient. Coded communications, compartmentalized knowledge, and international contacts all created layers of separation that made comprehensive exposure difficult. The resilience of such a system means that even partial recovery of evidence cannot fully illuminate the true extent of the network. The story of the finders is also a cautionary tale about the limits of institutional authority. Local and federal agencies encountered clear evidence of organized activity, potential exploitation, and deliberate secrecy, yet bureaucratic intervention and political pressures curtailed the investigation. This interference raises profound questions about accountability, transparency, and the ability of investigative agencies to pursue complex, sensitive cases without obstruction. The unresolved nature of the case serves as a reminder that evidence and facts alone are sometimes insufficient to compel action when powerful forces are at play. Despite the obstacles, the mystery of the finders continues to captivate and alarm. Researchers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers revisit the surviving materials, striving to reconstruct events, trace networks, and give voice to the children whose lives were affected. Each new inquiry adds to the body of knowledge, but also highlights how much remains unknown. The case persists as a source of fascination, fear, and frustration, symbolizing the enduring tension between secrecy and accountability, power and justice. For the public, the story remains a mixture of faith, speculation, and unanswered questions. The finders, once exposed in a small park in Florida, have become an emblem of organized secrecy, resilience, and the unseen influence of powerful networks. The children's stories, though partially documented, illustrate the human cost of a system designed to obscure and control. The missing files, redacted documents, and halted investigations leave the truth tantalizingly out of reach, ensuring that the mystery persists across decades. The lessons of the finders are complex and unsettling. They remind investigators, journalists, and the public that even with evidence, uncovering hidden networks can be fraught with difficulty. Power, secrecy, and influence can shield operations from scrutiny, leaving questions unresolved and accountability incomplete. The case challenges assumptions about transparency, oversight, and the protection of vulnerable populations, illustrating the potential consequences when organized networks operate beyond the reach of law and public awareness. Even today, discussions about the finders invoke the same sense of unease felt by investigators in 1987. What began as a seemingly simple incident of child neglect evolved into a case involving international networks, coded communications, and sophisticated planning. Yet the abrupt shutdown of the investigation and the disappearance of critical evidence created a void that continues to generate speculation. Scholars, journalists, and former investigators agree on one point: the story of the finders is far from fully told, and the unanswered questions are what make it enduringly unsettling. The mystery also raises questions about memory, perception, and the passage of time. Children who experience the network often have incomplete recollections, fragments of events that seem ordinary in isolation but disturbing when pieced together. Investigators and journalists must interpret these accounts alongside surviving documentation, attempting to reconstruct events that were deliberately hidden. The interplay between recorded evidence, eyewitness memory, and missing files makes the story both complex and compelling, a puzzle that may never be fully solved. Ultimately, the finders remain a symbol of hidden power and the enduring consequences of secrecy. Their story encompasses children moved across cities and countries, meticulously recorded operations, coded communications, and the inexplicable intervention of authorities who shut down investigations at the height of discovery. The surviving evidence tells part of the story, but the gaps, missing documents, and vanished files ensure that much of the truth remains inaccessible. The mystery endures, haunting investigators, journalists, and anyone who studies the case, raising the uncomfortable question: how much of what we see is only the surface, and how much has been deliberately hidden from view? The finders may no longer operate in the public eye, and the warehouse may have been emptied of evidence, but the legacy of the investigation continues. It serves as a cautionary tale about secrecy, power, and the limits of accountability. It challenges investigators to consider how networks can operate under the radar and how easily truth can be obscured. Most importantly, it reminds us that the children involved, though protected physically, were caught in a system that manipulated, controlled, and moved them without consent. Their stories remain incomplete, and their experiences are a testament to the enduring human impact of an unresolved mystery. Even decades later, the story of the finders retains its power to shock, unsettle, and provoke questions about the reach of hidden networks. Researchers continue to piece together fragments, hoping to uncover additional information, understand motivations, and expose connections that remain unseen. The case is far from closed in the minds of those who have studied it. It is a puzzle that challenges assumptions about authority, secrecy, and justice, leaving the audience with the chilling realization that some mysteries, even when partially uncovered, may never be fully solved. The finders, once exposed in a quiet park in Tallahassee, remain an enigma. The children, the documents, the coded communications, and the vanished files all point to an organization capable of operating with incredible precision and secrecy. Yet the ultimate truth, what exactly the group intended, how far their influence reached, and who protected them, remains shrouded in mystery. It is a story that refuses closure, a narrative that continues to intrigue, disturb, and challenge anyone who seeks to understand it. The case leaves a lasting question: In a world where organized networks can operate in shadows, where evidence can be removed and investigations halted, how much remains hidden, and what forces allow it to stay that way? The finders may be gone from public view, but the mystery they left behind is timeless, a haunting reminder that not every story ends with justice, and that some truths may remain buried forever.